They were told they didn't belong. They were told they weren't strong enough, smart enough, brave enough to wear the uniform. They were called every name designed to break a man's spirit before he ever set foot on a battlefield. But in the spring of 1943, a group of black men walked through the gates of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and into a military force that had never wanted them. A force that had spent nearly 2 centuries keeping them out. They were the first black Marines in United States history, and they were about to rewrite everything the Corps thought it knew about courage, excellence, and what it meant to be a warrior. The United States Marine Corps had a reputation. It was elite. It was feared. It was the tip of the spear in America's war machine. But it also had a policy, unwritten but absolute, that had kept black men out of its ranks since its founding in 1775. While the Army and Navy had begun accepting black soldiers in limited roles, the Marines had remained a fortress of exclusion. The reasoning was brutal and simple. Corps leadership believed that black men lacked the intelligence, the discipline, and the combat effectiveness necessary for Marine operations. They believed that integration would destroy unit cohesion and weaken the force. They believed, with the certainty of men who had never been challenged, that the Marine Corps was no place for colored troops. But war has a way of forcing change. By 1942, the pressure was mounting. Civil rights leaders were demanding action. President Roosevelt needed manpower. The other services were already training black units, and the Marines were running out of excuses. On June 25, 1942, the Commandant of the Marine Corps received his orders from the President. Begin recruiting Negro Marines. The announcement was made. The policy was changed, and the Marine Corps, furious and defiant, began preparing for what many of its officers considered a disastrous experiment. The first recruits arrived at Montford Point, a segregated training facility carved out of the swamps adjacent to Camp Lejeune. It was deliberately isolated, deliberately harsh, a place where the Marine Corps could hide these new recruits away from the white Marines they didn't want them associating with. The conditions were primitive. The barracks were hastily constructed. The heat was suffocating. The insects were relentless. And the drill instructors, almost all white men pulled from regular Marine units, arrived with something to prove. Some came determined to train these men properly. Others came determined to break them, to prove that the Corps had been right all along, that black men could never become Marines. The insults started immediately. On the training field, in the mess hall, during every moment of every day, the recruits heard it. They were called boys when they were men. They were called worse when the officers weren't listening. They were told they were too slow, too stupid, too lazy to make it. They were given the hardest details, the longest marches, the most degrading assignments. When they made mistakes, they were punished twice as hard as white recruits would have been. When they excelled, their achievements were dismissed or ignored. The message was clear and constant. You don't belong here. You never will. But something unexpected happened in those swamps. The men didn't break. They didn't quit. They absorbed every insult, endured every injustice, and kept moving forward. They woke before dawn and trained until they collapsed. They polished their boots until they could see their reflections. They memorized every manual, mastered every weapon, pushed themselves beyond what they thought possible. They understood something their instructors didn't. They weren't just training to become Marines. They were training to prove something larger than themselves. Every perfect formation, every completed obstacle course, every qualification earned was a refutation of every lie that had been told about their people. They were fighting 2 wars before they ever left American soil. One against the enemies of their nation, one against the prejudice of their countrymen. Among those first recruits were men who would become legends. There was Gilbert Hashmark Johnson, a veteran of the Army who had served in the Pacific and returned to enlist in the Marines, determined to prove that black men belonged in every branch of service. He was older than most recruits, tougher, and he refused to let the younger men quit when the training became unbearable. He would later become the first black Marine drill instructor, a man whose voice and presence would shape thousands of Marines in the years to come. There was Frederick Branch, a college graduate from North Carolina who would shatter another barrier by becoming the first black, commissioned officer in Marine Corps history. There were men from every corner of black America, farm boys from Mississippi who had picked cotton since they could walk, factory workers from Detroit who had built tanks and planes, college students who had put their education on hold to serve, men who had never been given a fair chance in civilian life and were determined to seize this one. They formed bonds in those brutal months that would last lifetimes. When one man struggled, the others carried him through. When the instructors tried to pit them against each other, they refused to break ranks. They became brothers in a way that men who haven't shared that particular crucible can never fully understand. They pushed each other, challenged each other, held each other accountable to a standard higher than anything the Marine Corps demanded, because they knew that one man's failure would be used to condemn them all, and one unit's success might open doors for thousands who would come after. And slowly, grudgingly, some of the white instructors began to change their minds. They watched these men run faster, shoot straighter, work harder than recruits they had trained for years. They saw discipline that would have impressed any unit in the Corps they witnessed. A pride and determination that couldn't be faked or taught. One drill instructor, a career Marine who had initially opposed the integration and had made his feelings brutally clear, pulled aside a black recruit after a particularly grueling day of training. The recruit expected another insult, another reminder that he didn't belong. Instead, the instructor looked him in the eye and said something he never thought he would say. "You're going to make it, Marine. You're going to make a hell of a Marine." The recruit stood taller, not because he needed the validation, but because he knew what it meant. The walls were cracking. The fortress was beginning to fall. By the end of 1943, the first Montford Point graduates were earning their eagle, globe, and anchor, the symbol every Marine wears with pride. They had completed the same training as every other Marine. They had met the same standards, passed the same tests, earned the same title. But they still weren't given the same opportunities. The Marine Corps, even in accepting black men, still didn't trust them in combat roles. The men who had proven themselves on every training field in America were assigned to support units, ammunition companies, depot companies, stevedore battalions. The dirty, dangerous, unglamorous work of loading ships, moving supplies, handling explosives, the work that needed to be done but would never win medals or make headlines. The men took their assignments without complaint. They understood the game being played. They would do the work no one wanted to do, and they would do it better than anyone else ever had. They would wait for their chance, and when it came, they would be ready. That chance came in the hell of the Pacific Theater. The island-hopping campaign that would define the Marine Corps' role in World War II was a meat grinder of unprecedented brutality. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was a fortress, each beach a killing ground, each battle a test of whether American forces could sustain the casualties necessary to push across the Pacific toward Japan. The casualty rates were staggering. The demand for men was insatiable. And suddenly, the ammunition companies and depot units staffed by black Marines weren't just support troops anymore. They were essential to every operation. They were in the thick of it. On Saipan in June 1944, the 18th, 19th, and 20th Marine Depot companies hit the beaches in the initial assault waves. They weren't supposed to be combat troops, but the Japanese didn't care about American organizational charts. Enemy fire raked the beaches from fortified positions in the hills. Mortar exploded in the surf, sending geysers of water and sand into the air. Snipers picked off men as they struggled through the black volcanic sand, weighted down with equipment. The black Marines kept moving. They unloaded ammunition under fire, working in human chains to pass crates from landing craft to shore to trucks. They carried supplies forward while bullets snapped past their heads and ricocheted off the coral. They manned machine guns when the infantry needed support, firing at muzzle flashes in the jungle. They rescued wounded men from exposed positions, dragging them to cover while mortar walked closer with each explosion. And when a Japanese counterattack threatened to overrun a critical supply depot on the third night, it was black Marines who held the line, fighting hand-to-hand in some cases, using rifle butts and bayonets in pure determination, refusing to give ground because they knew that losing that depot meant losing the battle. The performance reports started changing. White officers who had doubted these men now watched them work with something approaching awe. One lieutenant wrote in his diary praising the extraordinary courage and efficiency of the black Marines under fire. Another officer noted in his after-action report that the men had worked for 3 straight days under constant enemy bombardment, moving thousands of tons of ammunition without a single delay or failure to deliver to the front lines. The numbers were staggering. The work rate was unprecedented, and it was being done by men who had been told they weren't capable of serving. But the real test came at Peleliu in September 1944. The battle for this tiny coral island was supposed to take 4 days. It took 2 months. It became one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, with casualty rates exceeding 40% in some units. The Japanese had learned from previous defeats and had constructed an elaborate system of caves and fortifications in the coral ridges, turning the island into a killing ground where every yard was contested, where every position had to be taken at terrible cost. The 11th Marine Depot Company and the 7th Marine Ammunition Company were there from the first day, hitting the beach in the initial waves. immediately coming under devastating fire from Japanese positions that had been carved into the coral ridges overlooking the landing zones. The ammunition handlers faced a nightmare scenario. They had to bring tons of explosives ashore and move them inland while under constant bombardment. One spark, one direct hit on a loaded truck or a stockpile, and an entire section could be vaporized. The heat was over 110 degrees. The coral reflected it back like an oven, and men were collapsing from exhaustion and heat stroke within hours of landing. The wounded were everywhere, crying out for water and morphine. The dead were beyond counting, lying where they fell because there was no time to move them. And through it all, the Black Marines of the ammunition companies kept working. They formed human chains to pass ammunition forward when vehicles couldn't make it through the cratered roads. They drove trucks loaded with shells through enemy fire, gambling their lives on every trip because stopping meant death and turning back meant. Marines on the front lines would run out of ammunition and die. They worked through the night, guided only by flares and tracer fire, knowing that if they stopped, if they slowed down for even a moment, the battle could be lost. And then the records started falling. The officers keeping track of logistics couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Black Marine units were moving more ammunition, more supplies, more equipment than any similar units had ever moved in any previous operation. They were working faster, longer, more efficiently than anyone had thought possible. They were setting benchmarks that would be studied in Marine Corps schools for decades to come, standards that future units would struggle to match. One depot company moved over 2,000 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period, a rate that shattered every existing record and that logistics officers initially refused to believe until they verified the numbers themselves. An ammunition company delivered ordnance to frontline positions so rapidly and so reliably that artillery units never once had to cease fire due to lack of shells, an achievement that was unprecedented in the Pacific campaign. The White Marines fighting in the ridges began to notice. They saw the black trucks coming up the roads under fire, their drivers hunched over the wheel, racing to deliver ammunition before the next mortar barrage. They saw the Black Marines hauling cases of grenades and machine gun belts to forward positions while enemy fire chewed up the coral around them. They saw men who were supposed to be second-class citizens performing first-class service under the worst conditions imaginable. One infantry sergeant, writing home to his wife in a letter that would be saved and donated to a museum 70 years later, said something that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The colored Marines are the reason we're still fighting. They keep us supplied no matter what hell is coming down. They don't quit. They don't hide. They're Marines, same as us, and I'd serve with them anywhere. At Iwo Jima, in February 1945, the validation was complete. The iconic battle, immortalized by the flag raising on Mount Suribachi that would become the most famous photograph of the war, was also where Black Marines proved beyond any doubt that they belonged in the Corps. The 8th Marine Ammunition Company, the 36th Marine Depot Company, and the 38th Marine Depot Company were all there, all in the initial assault waves, all immediately engaged in the desperate fight to secure the beaches against Japanese defenders who had turned the island into a fortress. The volcanic ash made every movement exhausting, sucking at boots and bogging down vehicles. The Japanese defenders dug into tunnels and bunkers throughout the island, made every movement deadly with carefully prepared fields of fire. And the Black Marines did what they had always done. They worked. They set records that stand to this day. They moved ammunition at rates that logisticians later said should have been physically impossible given the terrain, the condition, and the intensity of enemy fire. They worked 20-hour shifts, caught a few hours of sleep in foxholes, dug into the volcanic ash, and went back to work. They braved enemy fire that killed hundreds of support troops across the operation. They handled explosives under conditions that violated every safety protocol, because the alternative was letting Marines die from lack of ammunition. And they earned something else, something that couldn't be quantified in tonnage or efficiency ratings, something that had been denied to them for their entire lives. They earned respect. White Marines who had grown up in segregated communities, who had been taught from childhood that black men were inferior, now fought alongside them and saw the truth with their own eyes. Officers who had opposed integration, who had written reports claiming that Black Marines would weaken the force, now wrote commendations for Black Marines who had saved their units and made victory possible. The Medal of Honor wasn't given to any Black Marines in World War II, an injustice that reflected the racism of the time and that wouldn't be corrected until decades later when historians finally uncovered the full scope of their service. But the men earned battlefield commendations, Purple Hearts for wounds received in action, and something more valuable than any medal. They earned their place. They earned their title. They had become, beyond question or doubt, United States Marines. By the time Okinawa was secured in June 1945, the final stepping stone before the planned invasion of Japan, Over 19,000 black men had served as Marines in World War II. They had participated in every major Pacific campaign from Saipan forward. They had set performance records in logistics and supply operations that had never been equaled, records that are still taught in military logistics courses today. They had proven that courage has no color, that excellence has no race, that the only thing that matters when bullets are flying is the person standing next to you and whether they'll hold the line. They had taken a military branch that had rejected them for over a century and a half and forced it to acknowledge their worth through sheer, undeniable performance. But the victory was bittersweet. When the men came home after Japan's surrender, when they stepped off ships and trains expecting to be welcomed as heroes, they came home to an America that still believed in segregation. They had fought for freedom abroad and returned to find it denied at home. They couldn't sit at lunch counters in the South. They couldn't vote in many states despite their service. They faced discrimination in employment, with businesses refusing to hire them even as they hired white veterans with less experience. They struggled to find housing, with neighborhoods and developments closed to them by law and custom. They tried to use the GI Bill to get an education, only to find that many colleges and universities wouldn't accept black students. The uniform that had meant brotherhood on Iwo Jima meant nothing in Birmingham. The men who had proven themselves on the bloodiest battlefields of the Pacific found they still had to prove themselves in their own country, still had to fight for basic dignity and equality. Yet something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. The men of Montford Point had kicked open a door that the Marine Corps had kept closed for over a century and a half, and once opened, that door could never be fully shut again. They had destroyed the myth of black inferiority in the most elite fighting force in America. They had shown a generation of white Marines that integration didn't weaken the Corps, it strengthened it, bringing in men who were just as capable, just as dedicated, just as willing to bleed for the uniform. They had planted seeds that would grow into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. As veterans who had faced down Japanese machine guns refused to back down from segregationist politicians, they had demonstrated through action rather than argument that the basis for discrimination was not fact but fear, not reality but prejudice. They had proven that when given a fair chance, black Americans could excel in any field, meet any standard, overcome any obstacle. The path they cleared led to President Truman's executive order in 1948 desegregating the entire military, a decision that was directly influenced by the performance of black Marines and soldiers during the war. It led to the integration of the Marine Corps in the 1950s, ending the separate training facilities and segregated units. It led to the first black Marine officers, then the first black Marine generals, then eventually to a military where skin color became increasingly irrelevant compared to skill, dedication, and leadership. The transformation wasn't fast and it wasn't easy. Racism didn't disappear from the Corps or from America, but the Montford Point Marines had proven it was possible to change, had demonstrated that institutions built on exclusion could be transformed into institutions of opportunity. The last Montford Point Marine passed away in 2022 at the age of 100. By then, they had finally received the recognition they deserved. In 2012, the surviving Montford Pointers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, in a ceremony that brought together men who hadn't seen each other in decades. At the ceremony, old men who had once been young Marines stood together one more time, some in wheelchairs, some with walkers, all wearing their dress blues, all wearing their pride. They had waited 70 years for their nation to say thank you. They had waited 70 years to hear what they had always known. They were Marines. They had always been Marines. And they had earned that title in a way few others ever could, overcoming not just enemy fire but their own nation's prejudice. Today, the Marine Corps is one of the most diverse branches of the American military. Black men and women serve at every rank, in every role, in every corner of the globe. They command infantry battalions and pilot F-35s. They lead reconnaissance teams and serve as snipers. They are drill instructors at Parris Island and Camp Pendleton, shaping new generations of Marines with the same intensity and pride that shaped them. They are generals and sergeants majors, setting policy at the highest levels and leading from the front in combat zones. And every single one of them, whether they know the history or not, walks a path that was cleared by the men of Montford Point, the men who faced insults and broke records, the men who proved that the only color that matters is the one every Marine wears, the deep forest green of the Corps. The story of the Black Marines of World War II is not just a story about war. It's a story about human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. It's a story about excellence in the face of doubt and discrimination. It's a story about men who loved a country that didn't love them back, who served a nation that denied them equality, who fought for freedom they themselves didn't fully possess. It's a story about courage that went beyond the battlefield, about battles fought in training camps and mess halls and in the hearts of men who had to prove themselves every single day of their service. It's a story about the long, difficult struggle for civil rights and equality, and how that struggle was advanced by men who demanded the right to serve, the right to fight, the right to prove their worth on the same terms as any other American. And it's a story that needed to be told, a story that needs to be remembered and passed down to future generations. A story that reminds us that progress doesn't happen by accident or through good intentions alone. It happens because people refuse to accept injustice even when that injustice is backed by law and tradition and the full weight of institutional power. It happens because people push doors open even when they're told those doors are locked forever. It happens because people like the Montford Point Marines understood that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for generations that would come after them, for a future where the color of a man's skin would not determine the content of his service or the measure of his worth. They faced insults that would have broken lesser men. They broke records that stood for generations. They became legends whose story deserves to be known by every American. And they changed the Marine Corps, and through it, America itself forever. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive and allows us to continue bringing you the history that wasn't taught in schools. Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you have a connection to the Montford Point Marines or know someone who served. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. These men fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against tyranny overseas and one against prejudice at home. And they won both through sheer determination and excellence. Their legacy deserves to be remembered, honored, and shared with every generation that follows, because their story is American history at its most painful and most inspiring. A reminder of how far we've come and how much we owe to those who forced that progress through their sacrifice and service.